Welcome to Old Testament Survey. Again, it's great to have you along for this course during this term. In this introductory video, we're going to cover some background information rather than getting into the text of the Old Testament itself. I'm going to go through a few things that I hope will help you to understand the Old Testament better as we move through it during the rest of the semester. In particular, there are three items that you need to have some familiarity with before we proceed further, and those are what I am going to cover in these remarks. First, we're going to take a look at the shape of the Bible by looking at its table of contents and by looking at what are some of the writings that are contained in this collection. We'll try to see how it was organized and why it is put in the order it is, and why the Jewish and Christian faiths put the books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in different orders. Secondly, we're going to look a little bit at the geographical context of the Old Testament. In other words, where was it written, and how did that geographical context influence a lot of the events that are taken up in the Bible and described in the Old Testament. And then finally, we're going to spend some time looking at the history of the Old Testament. I'll try to give you a very quick overview and summary of what happened during the time when the Old Testament was written and during the time that it tells about. In other words, what is kind of the picture of history, essentially from the beginning of time until the time of the biblical writers' lives, and how does that influence what they wrote. So first of all then, I would like to have you take a few moments and get out your Bible and open it up to the table of contents. The Old Testament is probably best defined as the sacred writings of the Jewish faith. In these writings, those people who were writing it tried to explain who they thought God was, what they thought was the relationship between themselves and God, and what was their history, and how had that history been influenced by God in their relationship with Him. So if you found the table of contents by now, you will see that the Old Testament is not just one single writing. It's not as if somebody sat down and started writing in what we know of as the first verse of Genesis and kept writing and writing until they got to the end and said, "Good, now we have this holy book." On the other hand, your table of contents will show you that the Old Testament consists of 39 different writings, 39 separate documents written by people all trying to get at aspects of God and the faith of the Israelites and the interaction of God in Israelite history. As we move throughout the course, we will find out that those 39 books were probably written by many, many different people, all bringing their own perspective to what it is that they are addressing. Next time, we will find out that the process of writing the Bible was a very long and laborious one. Some of the earliest parts of the Old Testament were probably written as early as 12 or 1100 years before Christ. The latest parts of the Old Testament were probably written in the 500s or 400s before Christ, or some scholars think perhaps even later. So what I'm saying is that the different writings in the Old Testament were written over a period of probably 800 to 1,000 years. Moreover, each individual writing, or each individual book, as we call it in the Old Testament, was also written over a long period of time. So even with any given book, it's not as if one person just sat down and started writing from beginning to end. Rather, each book was composed probably over a period of time and involved the work of many different people. With that being said, let's kind of take a look at how this overall collection of 39 books has been written and put together. And let's see what are the different kinds of writing that we are going to find in these documents. So what I'd like for us to do to start out with here is to begin by listing the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So if you're looking at it in your table of contents, you'll notice that the first 5 books in order are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. After Deuteronomy, we're going to go on and we're going to have the books of Joshua and Judges. After Joshua and Judges, the next book in the Old Testament is going to be Ruth, and we're going to write that kind of over to the right-hand side of the screen for now. You'll see in a little bit why we're doing that. And then after Ruth, we're going to have the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, in what we have so far, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are going to tell a lot of what happens before the Israelites actually come into their land as a nation. Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings are going to tell what happens after the nation of Israel comes into its land. So those books are more historical in nature. Now after 1st and 2nd Kings, you're going to see that we're going to have 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We will put those over on the right-hand side of the screen. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, those 2 books are also historical in nature. They cover a lot of the same material that we're going to have in Samuel and Kings. And then after that, we're going to have Ezra, and then Nehemiah, and then finally Esther. And after Esther, you will see Job, and then after Job, Psalms, then Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes, then the Song of Songs, and then we're going to go back and continue with the order of books that we had before with Isaiah, and after Isaiah comes Jeremiah, after Jeremiah, Lamentations, and then Ezekiel, and then we will go to the book of Daniel, and then finally our Old Testament is going to end with Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So what scholars have noticed then, and the way we usually divide up the Bible, is by identifying these books as fitting into one of 3 different categories. So first we have the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And after the Torah, we have the prophets. And the prophets, in turn, can be divided into 2 more subsections. First of all, those historical books from Joshua through 1st Kings are often called the former prophets. And then those books from Isaiah all the way down through Malachi are referred to as the latter prophets. And then finally, the last category of writings in the Old Testament that we have is called the writings. So I want you please to be familiar with these 3 different categories of books from the Old Testament: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Also, I want to make you aware that the Torah is also often referred to as the Pentateuch. The root pent, P-E-N-T, means 5. That is, the Pentagon is a 5-sided building in Washington, D.C., where the Defense Department is located. So sometimes that's called the Pentateuch. So the Torah, the prophets, and the writings are kind of the 3 major categories of books that we have in the Old Testament. Now, let's talk just a little bit about the prophets. I've already alerted you to the fact that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are not the typical kinds of writings that we might associate as with prophets or call prophets. They are historical books, and they are in the category of prophets because a lot of the main characters in them are prophets, and there may have been some beliefs at one time that it was various prophets who wrote them. The latter prophets, on the other hand, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, are the 3 major prophets, and then Hosea through Malachi are the minor prophets, not because they're less important, but rather because they are simply shorter. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, those books are of a very different nature than the former prophets of Joshua through 2 Kings. The latter prophets, these books that are named after prophets, primarily contain the words that were spoken by the prophets, believed to be given to them by God. They are often in the form not of prose, they don't tell stories so much, but rather they are poetry. And so the former prophets give us a history, the latter prophets contain the words of prophets, and then finally the writings are kind of a mixture of everything else. There are psalms, which are probably hymns that were used in the worship in the temple in ancient Israel. There are wisdom writings like Proverbs, which contain a lot of proverbs. Some of the other writings are also poetry like Lamentations. Daniel and Esther and Ruth tell stories about individuals. Ezra and Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles tell some of the same historical information that we have in Samuel through Kings. Now, what I've always found interesting is that the order in which the books are printed on your screen right now is the order in which those books exist in the version of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible that the Jewish people use. So if you go buy a Jewish Bible, this is the order in which the books will be. But you'll notice that in the Christian tradition, those books have been changed in terms of their order, in the sense that the writings have been placed in the midst of the prophets. So, for example, after 1st and 2nd Kings, the Christian Bible puts 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. It makes sense because those books tell about history just like Joshua through 1st and 2nd Kings do. And then Esther is also kind of a historical writing from very late in Israel's history, and that book would be next. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon are all going to be placed between the former prophets and the latter prophets. Lamentations in the Old Testament is going to be placed right after Jeremiah because, according to tradition, it was written by Jeremiah. Daniel is going to be placed between Ezekiel and Hosea because Christian tradition sees Daniel as a prophet, whereas the Jewish tradition does not. And so then finally, the Christian version of the Old Testament is going to end with the prophets, and particularly with the minor prophets. And so after the Christian tradition took all of these writings and placed them in the midst of the prophets, it resulted in a Christian table of contents to the Old Testament that looked like this: Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then history books, Joshua through Esther, poetry and wisdom, Job through the Song of Solomon, and then ending with the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then the book of the 12 minor prophets. I think that part of the reason they did this is because the Christian tradition is going to see Jesus and the things that are described in the New Testament as the fulfillment of some of the things that were foretold by the prophets. And so it only made sense that just before the book of Matthew, which tells about Jesus, the Old Testament would end with the prophets, which in the minds of the New Testament writers tell about and predict the coming of Jesus. And so these are some of the differences between the way the Jewish faith looks at the order of the Old Testament and the way that the Christian faith looks at it. So please try to keep the names of these different categories from both the Jewish and the Christian tradition in mind as we continue throughout the semester, because I will be referring to them fairly frequently. Okay, the second thing I want to spend some time on in this presentation is talking a little bit about the Old Testament and its geographical context. We're going to talk both about what is the geography of the land of Israel, where the Old Testament was written and whose history the Old Testament tells about. So we'll talk about what Israel was like geographically for just a little bit. And then we'll go on to talk more about how Israel's geographical position in the Mediterranean world as a whole was also very important to its history and to the history of the Old Testament. So here's roughly a map of Israel. Israel then was located roughly where Israel is located today. There's a lot of fighting and disagreement between Israelis and Palestinians about the different parts of this land today. As we continue through the course, we'll find out that a lot of that fighting is nothing new. Okay, scholars pretty much, or geographers, recognize that this land really consists of 4 different zones that run parallel to each other from north to south. And the geographical features and climate of those different zones are quite different from each other and set them apart from one another. The first zone, as we might call it, is the coastal plain, which exists right along the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. I've tried to mark it off possibly with a line. This part of Israel would have been fairly easy to navigate. It would have been even and it would have been flat. We're going to see that other nations as well occupied some of this area, particularly the Philistines down toward the south, and this is going to lead to some conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. The second major geographical area is going to be what we refer to as the Central Hill Country. Some of these mountains rise up to a fairly high altitude. This is going to be the area where most of the Israelites, where most of the people in Israel are going to live. It's going to be the area where that nation is going to be formed. A lot of agriculture and animal raising is done in this area. Much of it is done by building terraces in order to catch the water and to stop some of the erosion. Jerusalem, you'll notice, is going to be kind of in this area as well. The other thing to say something about is rainfall. The average annual rainfall in the Central Hill Country is probably about 22 inches a year. Our average rainfall in South Carolina is about 50 inches a year, so probably just under half as much rainfall in a year as we get here in South Carolina. That is going to make the climate kind of a concern for people, because back in those days, especially when they didn't have methods of irrigation in Palestine, they would have depended on rain in order to get their crops to grow, and it would have been very stressful if they didn't get as much rain as they needed. And speaking of rain, they tended to have a wet season and a dry season. The wet season went from late fall through early spring, and then the dry season went from early spring to late fall. And then working our way from west to east, the third vertical zone that is going to be part of Israel is going to be the Jordan River Valley. That river valley was a place where fewer people would have lived, and a lot of that had to do with climate. The mountains to the west, the mountains of the Central Hill Country, would have blocked most of the rain from getting to the Jordan Valley. So again, we said that the hill country might have received around 22 inches of rain per year, but just a little bit to the east in the Jordan Valley, it was probably closer to 6 inches a year, so going to be a very dry location there. And then finally, the fourth zone would have been what we call the Transjordanian Plateau. Trans means across, so this is the area that is across or on the east side of the Jordan River. For much of Israel's history, that was not actually part of the nation of Israel, but Moab and Edom and Ammon would have been a couple of the nations that would have been over there. The amount of rainfall decreases as we continue to head east, and finally you'll notice that heading east of the plateau, we are going to be into the Syrian Arabian desert. So that's a good transition into our next topic, which is the geographical context of Israel and the Old Testament within the larger Mediterranean world. As we've noted several times, Israel, Palestine is located along the Mediterranean Sea. Compared to a lot of the nations around it, Israelite was a very small and not very powerful nation. For example, other nations that are going to surround Israel are going to have a great influence on its history and present many challenges for God's people. Over here, of course, is going to have Egypt. Then the Hittite Empire is up here. This is where Turkey is going to be located today. The two other nations that are going to cause a lot of problems for Israel and be a great challenge are going to be Babylonia and Assyria. Those two nations are located in what is today Iraq, in the area that we call Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the word Mesopotamia means between the two rivers, and so because most of that land is between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they've given it the name Mesopotamia. Now you'll remember we said that a lot of this area here is going to be deserts and mountains, making a journey across it impossible. Therefore, if you wanted to travel from one of these nations in Mesopotamia down to Egypt, say for instance, you would have to go up the river valley and then come back down, either on the way of the sea or perhaps come back just on the side of the Jordan River and continue your travels into Egypt. So if Babylonia wanted to trade with Egypt, this is the route that their merchants would have to follow. The same way, if the Egyptians wanted to take something to Babylonia or Assyria and wanted to trade with them, that's the same route that they would have to travel. The same thing would be with travel between the Hittite Empire and Egypt. Once again, they're going to have to come down right through Israel or right next to Israel in order to make that journey. As the result of this, the Levant, as it's called here, Palestine, where Israel was located, was very desirable and very valuable property, because whoever controlled that land essentially controlled the economy of this part of the world. In fact, for a while, one of the ways that the Israelites gained a lot of wealth was to charge taxes to anybody who wanted to go through. So if some Assyrians or Babylonians are on their way to Egypt, the Israelites could charge them taxes to pass through, and they didn't have any choice but to pay those taxes, because there was no way they could make the journey straight across the desert and survive it. As a result, all of the nations of the ancient world wanted that land, and they were willing to fight for it very frequently. As a result, you will notice that when we are reading these stories of Israel, that we are often reading about wars and attacks by other nations. For instance, Babylon tried earlier on to possess as much of what you see on the map here as they possibly could. Later on, Assyria had control of Mesopotamia, and every year Assyria would try to send its armies all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea so they could have control of all of this land. Egypt as well tried to come up and have control of Israel, and in fact, one of the things that happened is that Israel, a very small and relatively powerless nation, would sometimes get caught between the Egyptians and the Assyrians, or the Egyptians and the Babylonians, who are both fighting for that land. And so the geography of Israel, the very desirable land on which it was located, and the economic clout that came with being on that land, made it very vulnerable to attacks from other major empires that wanted to possess that land for their own economic and political benefit. And so, as we'll see from already in the book of Genesis all the way to the end of the Old Testament, Israel is constantly, it seems, under attack by some of these other nations. And in fact, a big part of the purpose of the Old Testament is to explain those constant challenges religiously and theologically. In other words, why does their God constantly allow them to be defeated by these other nations? Okay, and so the third thing I want to talk about in today's presentation then is just a little bit of the history of the Old Testament times. We're going to present a brief summary of ancient Israel's history in the way that the Bible presents it. And so we're going to give you kind of a summary of the Old Testament and the historical events here in just a couple of minutes. The Old Testament story in Genesis 12 is going to start sometime shortly after 2000 BC, and that is what we call the Age of the Patriarchs. During this period of time, there's going to be a lot of movement in this entire part of the world, and in particular, in Genesis, we're going to read about how a man by the name of Abraham, who originally starts out down here in Babylonia, is going to make a journey and eventually spend much of his time, much of his life here in the land that will eventually be known as Israel. This Age of the Patriarchs that lasts from about 2000 to 1550 is told in the form of a story about 4 different generations of sons in the book of Genesis. The stories in Genesis about people with extended families making journeys throughout the world at that point and moving on is probably fairly accurate historically. There was a lot of that kind of movement about during this period of time. Okay. Now, as the biblical story tells us, in 1550 BC, Abraham's descendants, some members of that very first family, are eventually going to make a journey down here into Egypt. And while they are in Egypt, a couple of things are going to happen. First, that extended family is going to continue to reproduce until before long they have multiplied into a great number of people. Secondly, when they get to become a great number of people, they are going to be enslaved down there by the Pharaoh. And they are going to stay in Egypt as slaves until about 1280 BC. A lot of the book of Exodus, the first half of Exodus in particular, is going to tell about that time of slavery. The book will also tell us about these people's escape from Egypt in about 1280, from where this nation of Israel is going to make a journey, probably through some part of the wilderness here, and eventually is going to come back right here to ancient Palestine. It will take about 200 years for them to make their way back to Palestine, for them to defeat the nations that are already there, and to start to establish themselves as a nation. So the Exodus is the name we give to the escape from Egypt. The conquest is the process of taking over the countries that are already there. This conquest is going to be described especially in the book of Joshua and Judges, and then the settlement, kind of the process of forming themselves into a nation. Okay, in about 1020, the Israelites are going to finally appoint for themselves their first king, a king by the name of Saul. And then 20 years later, in about the year 1000 BC, their second king by the name of David, who will come to the throne. After David, the king is going to be his son Solomon. So these 3 first kings are going to reign roughly during that 30-year period, or during that 100-year period rather, from 1020 to 922. We call this the United Monarchy, first of all because it's a monarchy. In other words, it's finally one joint nation ruled over by one king, rather than a confederation of separate tribes as it had been earlier. And secondly, it's united because those 3 kings of this monarchy are going to rule over the entire area of Israel, both the northern half and the southern half. In 922 BC, however, the nation is going to split into two halves, and for 200 years they will live under what is called the divided monarchy. Okay, the line on this map shows you roughly where the border between the two separate kingdoms would have been. Everything north of the line was referred to as Israel, and everything south of the line was referred to as Judah. So from about 922 BC to 722 BC, these were two separate nations, Israel and Judah. They each had their own kings. Sometimes the two nations would work together and would cooperate against enemies. More often, probably, however, they were fighting against each other as two separate, distinct countries with competing interests. Now, in 722, things are going to change drastically. The northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, is going to be defeated and essentially wiped off the map by the nation of Assyria. Remember, we said that these large empires tried to expand as much as they could, and if they could expand as far as the Mediterranean, they could have pretty much complete control over that part of the world because of their control of the travel routes. And so finally, after threatening Israel for a number of years, in 722, Assyria will finally defeat it. Now, the southern kingdom is going to manage to hang on for a number of years after that. From 722 to 587, the southern kingdom, which we call Judah, will continue to exist alone by itself. However, Judah also would not last forever. In 587 BC, the greatest, most cataclysmic event in the history of God's people takes place when they are defeated by the Babylonians. The Babylonian armies are going to come down. They will take a good number of the residents of Judah with them into captivity back to Babylonia. They will especially take with them the wealthy and those people who have special skills and ability, those who are the more powerful members and the leadership of the society. That period of time is often going to be referred to as the exile. You will hear me mention it a lot during the course, so please remember what it's referring to. Much of the Old Testament, as a matter of fact, was written and finally put together in its final form as an effort to explain to the people why God would allow this great catastrophe to happen, why God would allow the exile, why God would allow his people, after all the promises he had given them of his love for them, why God would allow them to be defeated by this foreign nation. The exile is usually dated from 587 to 539, and then in 539 begins what we often call the post-exilic period, because in 539 the Babylonians are in turn going to be defeated by the Persians, and the great Persian Empire is going to take over. The Persians were generally kinder to the nations that were part of their empire than were the Babylonians. So when Persia defeated the Babylonians, and now Judah was part of the Persian Empire, the Persians allowed some of the people, the Jews who'd been taken to Babylonia, to go back and attempt to reestablish their life in Judah and in Jerusalem. Of course, they were still part of the Persian Empire, but the Persians generally encouraged other nations to continue their life together in a way that the Babylonians certainly did not. And so again, it's during the exile and during this post-exilic period that much of the Old Testament was either written or put together in the form that we have it as a way to explaining why all that had happened. Please keep some of these facts in mind as we go throughout the course. I'll be referring to them frequently, and so you'll be reminded of them regularly. Thanks again for taking the class, and I look forward to reading some of